Alcatraz housed America's most terrifying mob bosses, but the real torture was not the concrete walls. It was the absurd rulebook. The government turned this island into a psychological nightmare where dropping a spoon or spotting a speck of dust could literally ruin your life. Get ready for 44 of the dumbest, bizarre, and most humiliating survival rules you had to follow on the rock. 1. Mandatory hot showers twice a week sounds like a progressive spa treatment for murderers, but the reality was purely evil genius. Alcatraz was the only federal prison that strictly forced inmates to use steamy hot water. The warden was not running a wellness retreat. It was actually a ruthless security feature. By preventing the prisoners from getting used to cold water, the guards ensured their bodies remained totally unadapted. If any gangster miraculously sawed through his bars and hit the freezing waters of the San Francisco Bay, the thermal shock would instantly paralyze him. The government basically pampered these hardened criminals just enough to guarantee the ocean would finish them off if they ever tried to swim for freedom. 2. Getting a letter from your dear old mother should be a comforting moment, but the Alcatraz mailroom turned it into a dystopian nightmare. You were only allowed to receive mail from a tiny list of pre-approved blood relatives. But here is the truly insane part. The guards did not just read your mail and cross out secrets with a black marker. They literally took your mother's handwritten letter and completely retyped it on official prison stationery, meticulously editing out any news about the outside world they deemed inappropriate. Then they handed you the sterile, typed copy. You never got to hold the actual paper your family touched or see their handwriting. It was a brilliantly cruel way to sever your final physical and emotional connection to the real world. 3. Getting a fresh haircut inside this fortress was an absolute nightmare for any mob boss who cared about his slick appearance. You were not allowed to choose your style or keep your fancy hair pomade from your glorious bootlegging days. Instead, the prison barber gave every single inmate the exact same incredibly unflattering, humiliating buzz cut. Imagine the most feared mobsters in Chicago being forced to sit in a chair and get a toddler-style haircut, while a guard stood behind them with a wooden club. It was a hilarious but devastating psychological tactic to strip away their mafia vanity and make everyone look like a giant, grumpy thumb. 4. Let us kick things off with a rule so stupidly oppressive it literally drove men crazy. In the early days of Alcatraz during the 1930s, the administration enforced the infamous rule of silence. This was not just a polite suggestion to keep the noise down in the library. Inmates were strictly forbidden from uttering a single syllable while eating, working, or marching. If you whispered to the guy next to you, you were thrown into a pitch-black dungeon. It was supposed to break their rebellious spirits, but it just made guys snap. Prisoners started communicating by flushing toilets in Morse code, or simply losing their minds and screaming at the walls. Warden Johnston eventually had to scrap the policy because his high-security fortress was turning into a literal madhouse of silent zombies. 5. Picking up a paintbrush to pass the empty years sounds relaxing until the warden inspects your canvas for escape plots. Painting was an earned privilege, but the list of banned subjects was completely ridiculous. You were absolutely prohibited from drawing or painting any pictures of boats, the San Francisco skyline, or the waters of the bay. The guards genuinely believed that a simple watercolor painting of a sailboat was actually a highly sophisticated, coded escape map in disguise. If an officer caught you painting a nice little ferry boat, your art supplies were instantly confiscated and your masterpiece was destroyed. You had infamous mobsters forced to paint endless, boring bowls of fruit just to keep their hobby. 6. Forget about writing a strongly worded complaint to the manager at this concrete resort, because your welcome packet was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Upon arrival, every single convict was handed a rulebook highlighting rule number 5, which brutally stated you are entitled to food, clothing, shelter, and medical attention. End of list. Notice what is missing, literally everything else that makes life worth living. Having a job, getting a haircut, reading a book, or breathing fresh air in the recreation yard were all classified as extreme privileges. The guards could instantly revoke your right to do laundry or see sunlight just because you looked at them funny. You were explicitly told on day 1 that you were a piece of government property with absolutely zero human rights. 7. Dropping a simple soup spoon at dinner was not an embarrassing accident. It was treated like a full-scale prison riot. Alcatraz guards were absolutely terrified of missing utensils being sharpened into weapons, so every single fork and spoon was aggressively audited after meals. If a notorious mafia hitman accidentally dropped his spoon on the floor, the entire dining hall froze. Terrifying alarm bells went off, and guards swarmed the room like they were hunting a ghost. You had ruthless gangsters sweating bullets and dropping to their knees to search for a piece of cheap tin, just to avoid spending a week in the dark dungeon for the crime of Butterfingers. 8. Taking your daily vitamins or medicine involved a deeply invasive and humiliating daily performance right in the middle of the cell block. You could not just swallow a pill with water and walk away like a normal human being. The prison required a highly choreographed throat inspection to ensure nobody was hoarding medication to sell or stockpile. After you swallowed, you had to stand in front of the guard, open your mouth as wide as possible, stick your tongue out, and physically wiggle it from side to side. The guard would then shine a bright metal flashlight straight down your throat. Notorious crime bosses had to perform this ridiculous daily mouth dance just to get a basic aspirin for a headache. 9. You know how normal people might lend a buddy a pencil or trade a piece of fruit at lunch? In Alcatraz, handing another guy a literal napkin was treated like an international smuggling operation. The rulebook strictly prohibited trading, loaning, or giving away any personal property whatsoever. If you gave your cell neighbor an extra pair of socks because he was freezing, both of you were getting thrown straight into solitary confinement. The administration was incredibly paranoid that a simple trade of a library book was actually a secret code or a way to pay off gambling debts. You were completely isolated even when standing right next to another human being, making simple generosity a punishable offense. 10. Imagine having a boss so incredibly paranoid that you have to stop working and stand completely frozen like a garden gnome 13 separate times a day. That was the daily reality on the Rock. Inmates were subjected to relentless mandatory headcounts morning, noon, and night. Every time the whistle blew, you had to stand exactly by your cell door, face the steel bars, and remain perfectly silent while the guards tallied everyone up. If the math was off by a single digit, terrifying alarm bells would echo across the island, triggering an immediate lockdown. They counted you before you ate, after you ate, and even while you were trying to sleep. It was a maddening ritual designed to constantly remind the worst criminals in America that they were entirely trapped. 11. Working a brutally exhausting manual labor job was bizarrely considered the ultimate luxury that everyone desperately fought for. On the outside, these guys were millionaire bootleggers and bank robbers, but inside Alcatraz, they begged for the chance to scrub toilets or sweep the yard. The rulebook made it crystal clear that hard labor was an exclusive privilege, granted only to the most flawlessly behaved inmates. Doing mind-numbing tasks in the laundry room or making rubber mats was the only way to escape the crushing boredom of the tiny cell. If you made a single mistake or talked back to a supervisor, you were instantly fired and sent back to your cage for 24 hours a day. They literally weaponized the desire to do chores. 12. Catching up on current events was completely impossible because the warden enforced a total news blackout to keep the men utterly isolated. Inmates were allowed to check out magazines from the impressive prison library, but they never received the actual full copy. The guards employed a dedicated censorship team whose only job was to meticulously cut out any articles related to crime, current news, or prison life before handing it over. You would request a popular weekly digest and receive a bizarre paper skeleton that looked like literal Swiss cheese. Trying to read a story was a maddening puzzle of missing paragraphs and giant gaping holes. They effectively froze these guys in a time capsule, ensuring they had absolutely zero clue what was happening in the real world. 13. Hitting a majestic home run during weekend yard time was the absolute worst mistake you could possibly make. While normal baseball players get a standing ovation for knocking the ball out of the park, Alcatraz inmates got thrown straight into solitary confinement. Baseballs were considered highly valuable federal property, and hitting one over the wall into the freezing San Francisco Bay was legally classified as willful destruction of government equipment. So you had these incredibly strong bank robbers deliberately swinging like weak kittens, terrified that hitting the ball too hard would cost them their yard privileges for the rest of the year. 14. Making your bed in the morning required the precision of a master architect because the cell inspection rules were outrageously strict. You were living in a microscopic 5x9 concrete box, but the guards expected it to look like a luxury hotel room every single day. The wool blankets had to be folded at exact right angles and tucked in so tightly that a guard could literally bounce a standard coin off the mattress. If your pillow was slightly crooked, or a single cup was out of place on your microscopic shelf, you were written up for a major infraction. Imagine being a notorious mob boss and getting your weekend yard time canceled just because your bed sheets were a little wrinkly. It was an obsessive level of micromanagement designed to control their every waking second. 15. Catching a common cold could easily land you in solitary confinement if the prison doctor thought you were just acting. Alcatraz had a strict rule against malingering, which basically meant faking an illness to get out of hard labor. But the administration was so incredibly paranoid that they assumed every single cough or stomach ache was a grand conspiracy to escape the laundry room. If you went to the hospital ward complaining of a fever, and the doctor decided you looked perfectly fine, you were not just sent back to your cell. You were severely punished for attempting to deceive a federal officer. It created a hilarious but miserable situation where hardened gangsters tried their absolute hardest to hide their sneezes from the guards. 16. Playing a musical instrument was one of the few permitted hobbies, but the practice schedule was regulated with insane strictness. You were completely banned from bringing your guitar or saxophone into the main cell block to casually strum a tune. Instead, the administration designated a highly specific, short window of time during the recreation period where the prison band could play. The most absurd part is that notorious gangsters like Al Capone actually joined the band just to have something to do, ending up playing the banjo alongside rival mobsters. But if you missed a single note or played even 1 second past the allotted musical hour, the guards would immediately confiscate your instrument. Your musical career on the island could be ended over a slight tempo mistake. 17. Smoking a cigarette was one of the few permitted ways to relieve stress, but actually getting that cigarette lit was a humiliating daily comedy routine. Inmates were strictly forbidden from possessing matches or lighters because the warden was terrified they would burn the whole island down. Instead, you had to awkwardly wait by the cell bars with a cigarette hanging out of your mouth until a heavily armed guard slowly walked by with an official prison lighter. You literally had to beg the man who locked you up to lean in and spark your smoke, creating the most incredibly awkward and tense bonding moment in criminal history. 18. Walking down the hallway was treated like a high-stakes military parade where even a slight shuffle could get you punished. Whenever inmates moved between the cell house and the dining hall, they had to form a flawless single-file line. But you could not just stroll along. You had to maintain an exact, mathematically precise distance from the prisoner directly in front of you. If you walked too fast, dragged your feet, or accidentally let your arms swing too far from your sides, the guards would immediately pull you out of line. The absolute worst criminals in America were forced to march around the island like toddlers in a very intense kindergarten class. One wrong step meant losing your precious yard time for the entire week. 19. Keeping your hands warm in your own pockets was treated like a dangerous act of rebellion against the United States government. Alcatraz rules strictly demanded that inmates keep their hands out of their pockets at all times while walking anywhere outside their cells. The guards were obsessed with the idea that hidden hands meant someone was clutching a stolen kitchen spoon or a homemade weapon. Even in the freezing fog of the San Francisco winter, you had to march across the yard with your hands fully exposed to the biting wind. If a freezing convict instinctively tucked his fingers into his jacket to avoid frostbite, a tower guard would immediately blow a whistle and halt the entire line. 20. Picture this. You are finally exhausted enough to sleep on a miserable prison cot, but you cannot even pull the blanket over your head to block out the cold. The guards enforced a strict sleeping posture rule that completely ruined any chance of a cozy night. You were absolutely required to sleep with your face and hands fully visible at all times. If you rolled over and accidentally buried your head under the wool blanket, A guard would smash his nightstick against your steel bars to wake you up. They were so utterly terrified of inmates making fake heads out of soap to pull off a nighttime escape that they demanded visual confirmation of your breathing face all night long. Imagine getting punished just because you toss and turn in your sleep. 21. Enjoying a simple piece of chewing gum was treated like handling dangerous contraband. Gum was absolutely banned from the island, and possessing even a tiny chewed-up piece was a massive security violation. The wardens were incredibly paranoid that an inmate would use sticky gum to jam the intricate mechanisms of the cell locks or secretly take an impression of a guard key. If an officer caught you blowing a bubble or aggressively chewing your own spit, they would tear your entire cell apart looking for the contraband wrapper. You risked spending a full week in the dark, freezing isolation cells just for wanting fresh breath after eating terrible prison food. 22. Trying to gossip with your buddy in the next cell required you to become a highly skilled and completely disgusting amateur plumber. Since yelling through the concrete walls was strictly punished, inmates figured out they could drain the water from their toilets and yell directly into the empty porcelain pipes. This essentially turned the entire plumbing system into a giant, incredibly unsanitary communication network. But if a guard caught you kneeling on the cold floor, screaming into a toilet bowl about yesterday's terrible meatloaf, you were instantly written up for destroying prison infrastructure. You risked solitary confinement just to have a muffled, echoing conversation through a sewage pipe. 23. Getting a clean shave required a terrifying daily ritual that felt like a highly stressful hostage negotiation. Every morning, guards would hand out a single safety razor blade to each prisoner, but you were on a remarkably tight and heavily monitored clock. You had just a few minutes to lather up and scrape your face over a tiny sink before the guard returned to collect the blade. The exchange had to be visually confirmed. You had to physically hand the exact same piece of metal back to the officer, who meticulously inspected it to ensure nobody was trying to keep a sliver for a weapon. If you dropped the blade down the drain by accident, the entire cell block went into an immediate panic lockdown until they recovered the missing steel. 24. Writing a simple letter home required passing a ridiculous supply audit that felt like a high-stakes bank transaction. Inmates were issued exactly one wooden pencil, and you guarded it with your absolute life. If you accidentally snapped the tip while writing, you could not just ask for another one from the guard. The rules strictly demanded that you bring the broken pieces, including the tiny chunk of graphite, directly to an officer for visual confirmation. The administration was absolutely terrified that an inmate was secretly hoarding pencil lead to lubricate cell locks or sketch a master escape blueprint. You had famous bank robbers literally crawling on their hands and knees searching for a microscopic piece of broken lead just so they could finish a letter to their wife. 25. Taking care of your fingernails seems like basic hygiene, but the federal guards turned it into a bizarre weapon inspection. Inmates were forced to keep their nails trimmed extremely short, and officers would literally perform mandatory hand checks to ensure compliance. If your thumbnail grew a millimeter too long, you were not just considered messy, you were treated like an armed and dangerous threat. The wardens believed a sharp nail could be used to scratch a guard or slowly dig a hole through solid concrete over 30 years. So you had to aggressively file them down every single week, turning a routine grooming habit into a highly stressful security checkpoint where a hangnail could cost you your yard privileges. 26. Joining the Clean Plate Club was not just a polite request from your mother, it was a strict federal mandate at mealtime. Alcatraz boasted some of the best food in the entire prison system, serving fresh fruit and roasted meats to keep the inmates from rioting. But there was a massive catch. You were forced to eat absolutely every single crumb you put on your tray. Leaving a half-eaten potato or a crust of bread was a serious punishable offense. Guards monitored the garbage cans like hawks, and if you tossed out leftovers, you would lose your next meal entirely or get your recreation privileges instantly revoked. It was the most stressful fine dining experience in history, where a single leftover pea could land you in solitary confinement. 27. Moving around the prison meant learning a terrifying, high-stakes foreign language consisting entirely of metal whistles. The guards used a complex system of short and long whistle blasts to control every single movement of the inmates. One sharp blow meant freeze completely, 2 blows meant line up, and a long blast meant an immediate lockdown. If you had a momentary lapse in concentration and accidentally stepped forward on a 1-blow signal instead of a 2-blow signal, you were instantly written up for disobeying a direct order. The absolute stress of constantly decoding these aggressive bird calls turned a simple walk to the dining hall into a nerve-wracking military operation. 28. Finally making it to the outdoor recreation yard felt like heaven, until you realized you could not even hang out with a decent crowd. The rules explicitly banned inmates from gathering in groups larger than 3 people. If a 4th guy walked over to say hello and chat about baseball, the tower guards would immediately grab their rifles and blow their whistles. The warden was absolutely terrified that any group of 4 men was instantly plotting a sophisticated prison break or a violent riot. You had to constantly monitor your surroundings while playing catch, quickly scattering like scared pigeons the second another inmate wandered too close to your strictly regulated trio. 29. Reading a good Western novel in your cell was a rare treat, but enjoying the story out loud was strictly forbidden. The rules demanded absolute silence, and that meant zero tolerance for reading aloud, whispering the words, or even moving your lips while looking at a book. Guards would slowly patrol the cell house tiers, specifically watching inmates' faces as they read. If a guard saw a prisoner silently mouthing the words to a magazine article, they assumed he was secretly communicating with the guy next door. The guards would bang on the steel bars and write him up for a noise violation, even though the poor guy had not made a single actual sound. 30. Polishing your shoes is a nice habit, but the wardens turned it into a manic obsessive military drill that would make a drill sergeant weep. Even though inmates lived inside a dusty concrete box and their only social event was walking to the cafeteria, their heavy leather work boots had to shine like mirrors at all times. Guards would literally inspect your toes with flashlights during morning lineup. If a guard spotted a single speck of dust or a smudge on your heel, you were instantly written up for gross insubordination. These hardened outlaws spent hours furiously buffing their shoes with tiny rags, desperate to impress men who hated them. 31. Wearing the prison uniform came with a bizarre fashion mandate that would make even the strictest school principal blush. Your officially issued blue chambray shirt had to remain perfectly tucked in and fully buttoned up at all times, no matter how ridiculously hot it got inside the cell house. The rules specifically stated that only the absolute highest collar button could be left undone. If a guard caught you with a second button open while you were sweltering in the summer humidity, it was considered a blatant act of defiance against the federal government. You would be immediately written up for a uniform violation. They managed to turn the simple act of trying to cool down into a punishable crime, proving they controlled even the air touching your skin. 32. Keeping your microscopic concrete cell clean was not just about sweeping the floor, it involved polishing the very steel bars that kept you trapped. The cell inspection rules demanded that every single metal bar on the front of your cage be completely free of dust at all times. Guards would literally perform the legendary white glove test, slowly wiping their fingers across your iron door during morning inspections. If they found a single speck of gray dust on the steel, they would instantly cancel your weekend privileges. You had to obsessively wipe down your own prison cage every single morning, desperately polishing the exact bars that ruined your life just to appease a neat freak warden. 33. Getting a book from the prison library was a rare joy, but you had to treat that book like an ancient, fragile artifact. If you accidentally ripped a page, folded a corner to mark your spot, or dared to make a tiny pencil mark in the margin, the wrath of the administration came down hard. Damaging federal property was a severe violation that would instantly get your library card permanently revoked. The guards closely inspected every single page when you returned a novel, looking for secret messages or maps. If the previous guy spilled a drop of water on chapter 4 and you got blamed for it, you were suddenly spending your weekends staring at a blank concrete wall instead of reading. 34. Keeping personal secrets was completely impossible because the guards conducted brutal, random cell shakedowns without any warning. You could be peacefully reading a library book when a squad of officers would suddenly storm your microscopic cage and tear it apart. They did not just quickly look under the mattress, they meticulously unrolled your extra socks, checked inside your shoes, and flipped your heavy steel cot completely upside down. The administration was constantly hunting for hidden saw blades or hoarded sugar from the dining hall. Even if you were a flawlessly behaved inmate, watching guards aggressively dismantle your entire life on a random Tuesday was a humiliating reminder that you had zero privacy. 35. Managing your bathroom supplies required the careful budgeting skills of a professional accountant. Every inmate was issued a highly specific, standardized ration of toilet paper, and you were not allowed to have an inch more or an inch less. Guards would regularly inspect your cell shelf, and if they found you hoarding an extra roll, you were punished for stockpiling contraband. They were ridiculously paranoid that inmates would use extra paper to start fires or create fake dummy heads to fool the night guards. So you had to carefully calculate your daily usage, because asking the meanest guards in America for emergency bathroom supplies was a humiliating and terrifying process. 36. Wearing your gray prison cap was not a fashion choice. It was a mandatory outdoor survival requirement with zero room for personal style. The rulebook dictated that the official uniform hat had to be worn exactly squarely on your head the entire time you were in the recreation yard. You could not tilt it to the side to look cool, and you certainly could not take it off if the sun came out. The warden wanted absolute uniformity, making sure every single man looked identical from the watchtowers. If a sudden gust of wind blew your cap off your head, you had to freeze, politely ask a guard for permission to move, and carefully retrieve it before you were accused of trying to signal a passing ship. 37. Having a single shiny dime in your pocket was treated like possessing a loaded weapon. Alcatraz was a strictly cashless society, and inmates were completely banned from holding any actual currency. You could not buy anything anyway, but the warden was terrified that loose change would be used to bribe a guard or fund an escape network. If a surprise shakedown revealed a forgotten penny hiding in your shoe, you were instantly thrown into solitary confinement for possessing major contraband. They entirely erased the concept of money, ensuring you were completely financially powerless on the island. 38. Tossing a piece of leftover bread to a cute little seagull through the recreation yard fence was a fast track to absolute misery. You might think befriending a bird is a harmless way to pass the time, but the guards viewed it as a massive breach of sanitation and security. Feeding wildlife was strictly forbidden, and if you were caught sneaking a cracker to a pigeon, you were charged with wasting government food rations. Imagine being a feared train robber who survived massive shootouts, only to get dragged away to a pitch-black isolation cell because you tried to give a local seagull your leftover breakfast biscuit. 39. Think you can casually whistle a happy tune while sweeping the floor to pass the time? Not on this island, my friend. Even after they relaxed the absolute silence rule, singing, whistling, or humming in your cell was still strictly forbidden. The guards demanded a depressing library level of quiet at all hours. They argued that whistling could be a secret audio code to coordinate a massive riot. Or maybe they just really hated joy. If an officer caught you humming a popular jazz tune while doing your laundry, you were written up for creating a disturbance. You had to bottle up every single emotion and stay completely mute, transforming the entire cell house into a giant, incredibly tense library of notorious criminals. 40. Your steel bed was the only remotely soft thing in your concrete box, but treating it like a resting spot was a massive federal offense. The prison rule book strictly dictated that inmates were completely forbidden from sitting or lying on their cots during the daylight hours. From the moment the morning whistle blew until the evening lights out, that thin wool mattress was an untouchable monument. If a guard walked by and saw a tired bank robber simply resting his heavy legs on the edge of the blanket, it was an immediate write-up for laziness. You had to stand or sit on a cold folding metal chair for hours on end, staring longingly at your perfectly made bed right next to you. 41. Looking a prison guard in the eye for too long was legally classified as a threat to institutional security. The administration enforced an unspoken but incredibly strict rule against staring at the officers. If a notorious gangster glared at a guard from behind his cell bars, the officer would immediately write him up for insolence and disrespectful behavior. You had to master the art of looking slightly downward or focusing purely on the concrete wall behind them. They wanted to completely crush any lingering mafia pride, ensuring the inmates never felt like equals. Even a slightly arrogant smirk or an accidental prolonged glance could easily buy you a miserable weekend, locked away in the pitch-black dungeon. 42. Staring longingly at the beautiful San Francisco skyline was unofficially treated as a dangerous psychological hazard. The administration knew that seeing the sparkling city lights and hearing the distant sounds of parties floating across the bay was pure mental torture. Guards actively discouraged inmates from lingering by the recreation yard fences to admire the view. If you spent too much time looking at the free world, officers assumed you were memorizing ferry schedules or plotting a desperate swim. You had to constantly pretend the vibrant, bustling city just a mile away completely ceased to exist. 43. Getting some healthy exercise in the recreation yard sounded great until the guards banned actually moving fast. Inmates were completely prohibited from running, jogging, or even walking at a brisk, suspicious pace. The warden firmly believed that anyone sprinting across the concrete was either trying to build enough momentum to launch themselves over the fence or charging up to attack another prisoner. So the most dangerous men in America were restricted to a casual, agonizingly slow stroll during their only outdoor time. If a guard caught you jogging just to catch a stray baseball, they would instantly blow a whistle, freeze the entire yard, and punish you for attempting a high-speed riot. 44. Doing your laundry required passing a bizarre test in advanced knot tying before your clothes were ever touched. When inmates bagged up their dirty gray uniforms for the weekly wash, they were strictly required to tie the top of the canvas sack using one specific, officially approved knot. If you used a slightly different loop or tied it too tightly, the guards running the laundry facility would flat out refuse to wash your clothes. They claimed non-standard knots slowed down the efficiency of the federal wash cycle. You could easily end up wearing the exact same smelly, sweat-soaked work shirt for 2 straight weeks purely because your knot-tying skills were not up to government standards. Surviving the rock clearly required the patience of a saint and an obsessive love for perfectly folded blankets. But history is full of dark secrets, so what bizarre Alcatraz rule or insane prison punishment did we completely forget to mention in this video? Drop your best historical facts down in the comments, smash that like button, and subscribe for more unbelievably weird history.